This is more than enough for your silence. Do not contact my son again.
The heavy envelope of cash hitting the dark walnut table sounded like a gunshot. The matriarch of Seoul's deadliest syndicate looked at me like I was dirt on her expensive shoes, offering me $3 million to forget her son existed. I didn't know it then, but refusing that money would start a war that would burn this city to the ground. And the man I had saved from dying in an alley was about to show his family exactly what happens when you threaten his queen. Welcome back to Mimi's Afro-Korean drama. If you live for fiercely protective men, intense family tension, and heroes who will tear down their own empires for the women they love, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss a single second of this. My fingers were coated in warm copper. I was 2 blocks from my apartment, exhausted from a 12-hour ER shift, kneeling in the freezing mud of a lightless alley. Slumped against the brick wall was a massive, breathtakingly handsome Korean man. His expensive dark suit was shredded, and he was losing blood faster than the rain could wash it away. I shouldn't have walked into the dark. Survival instincts screamed at me to keep my head down, ignore the shadows, and hurry home. But I was a nurse, and leaving a dying person on the street simply wasn't in my DNA. I stepped off the sidewalk, the pouring rain masking the sound of my sneakers hitting the pavement. Slumped against a brick wall, surrounded by the shattered remnants of a brutal fight, was a man. He was massive, his broad shoulders tearing at the seams of a ruined, incredibly expensive dark suit. His head was bowed, thick, midnight dark hair plastered to his forehead by the downpour. I dropped to my knees beside him, the freezing puddle soaking instantly through my jeans. "Hey," I whispered, reaching out with trembling fingers. "Can you hear me?" The moment my fingertips brushed the hard, muscular plane of his chest, he moved with terrifying speed. His large, blood-stained hand shot out in the darkness, wrapping around my wrist with a grip so crushing it forced a sharp gasp from my lips. His head snapped up. Even beaten, bleeding, and half-conscious, he was the most breathtakingly handsome man I had ever seen. He looked to be in his late 20s, with sharp, aristocratic features, a strong jawline, and dark, feral eyes that locked onto mine with lethal intensity. He wasn't looking at me like a savior. He was looking at me like a threat. "Let go!" I choked out, trying to pry his iron fingers off my wrist. "I'm a nurse. I'm trying to help you." He didn't release me. His heavy, erratic breathing ghosted over my face, smelling of rain and copper. For a split second, I thought he was going to snap my arm. Instead, his eyes rolled back, and his entire massive frame slumped forward, his dead weight collapsing directly against my chest. The sheer size of him knocked me backward onto the wet pavement. Panic spiked in my throat. He was losing too much blood, and if whoever did this to him came back to finish the job, we were both going to die in this alley. My apartment was less than a block away. I couldn't call an ambulance, not with the heavy, matte black handgun I just noticed lying inches from his expensive leather shoe. Gritting my teeth against the freezing rain, I kicked the heavy gun into my tote bag, hooked my arms under his heavy shoulders, and began the agonizing task of dragging a dying stranger into my home. Getting his dead weight through my front door took every ounce of strength I had. My worn living room rug was instantly ruined, soaking up a mixture of freezing rain and dark crimson the second I let him slide onto my beige sofa. I didn't have time to worry about the mess. I ran to my bathroom, tearing through the cabinets for my emergency trauma kit. When I rushed back, he was completely motionless, too still. My hands shook as I used trauma shears to cut away his ruined suit jacket and the soaked white shirt underneath. The expensive fabric gave way, revealing a broad, heavily muscled chest covered in the map of faded silver scars. This wasn't the body of an ordinary businessman. Whoever this man was, violence was a regular part of his life. I found the source of the heavy bleeding, a deep, jagged laceration across his lower ribs. It was bad, but thankfully, it hadn't hit an artery. The sharp, sterile smell of rubbing alcohol filled my tiny living room as I aggressively cleaned the wound. I threaded the surgical needle, took a steadying breath, and pierced his skin to start the first stitch. He didn't groan. He exploded. His eyes snacked open, wild and pitch black. Before I could even blink, his hand shot out like a steel trap springing shut. His long fingers wrapped around my wrist, pinning my arm against the back of the sofa with a terrifying, bone-crushing force. He hoisted himself up, his free hand instinctively reaching for a weapon at his waist that was no longer there. The air in the room vanished. The sheer, overwhelming strength in his grip sent a sharp jolt of genuine fear straight up my spine. He could break my arm with a simple twist of his wrist. His chest heaved, his feral gaze frantically scanning my cramped, dimly lit apartment before finally locking onto my face. "Don't move," he rasped, his voice a deep, gravelly vibration that sent a treacherous shiver over my skin. I forced myself to stay completely still, swallowing past the knot in my throat. I didn't fight his grip. Instead, I channeled every ounce of calm authority I used in the chaotic ER. "You are safe," I said softly, keeping my voice steady and low. "I'm a nurse. You were bleeding out in the alley down the street, and I brought you here to stitch you up." I slowly glanced down at the needle still pinched between my fingers, then back up to his intense, dark eyes. "If you break my wrist, you're going to bleed all over my couch." The lethal tension radiating from his massive frame faltered. He blinked, the wild paranoia in his gaze slowly dissolving into profound confusion. His eyes dropped to my blue medical scrubs, then to the sterile supplies scattered on my coffee table, before finally returning to my face. He didn't let go of me, but his brutal grip softened into something warm and heavy, his thumb slowly brushing against my racing pulse. I carefully pressed the final piece of medical tape over the gauze on his ribs. The suffocating tension in the room hadn't completely vanished, but his brutal hold on my wrist had finally loosened. He pulled his hand away, slowly pushing himself up into a seated position. The wild confusion in his eyes was gone, instantly replaced by a cold, impenetrable mask. He didn't look like a wounded man anymore. He looked like a king, assessing a highly inconvenient situation. His dark gaze swept over my cramped apartment once more before landing on the front door. "I am leaving," he announced. His voice was a low, commanding rasp that left absolutely no room for argument. "You lost nearly 2 pints of blood," I countered, crossing my arms as I stood my ground. "If you walk out into that freezing rain, your blood pressure will drop, and you won't even make it past the bottom of the stairs." He completely ignored me. With a stubborn clench of his sharp jaw, he planted his bare feet on the ruined rug and forced himself to stand. For a fraction of a second, his massive frame towered over me, radiating a terrifying, untouchable pride. But the human body doesn't care about pride. The moment he took his first step, a sharp, ragged grunt tore from his throat. All the color drained from his face, and his knees violently buckled beneath him. I moved entirely on instinct. I lunged forward, wedging my shoulder directly under his heavy arm just before he could crash into the coffee table. The sudden impact of his solid, muscular chest against my side forced the breath from my lungs. He was incredibly heavy, and the sheer heat radiating from his bare skin sent a confusing, electric jolt straight through my scrubs. Are you completely out of your mind? I snapped, struggling to lock my knees and keep us both upright. I glared up at him, my frustration completely overriding my fear. Why are Korean men so impossibly stubborn? The room fell dead silent. He froze, his heavy arms still draped over my shoulders. Slowly, he turned his head, looking down at me. The arrogant, icy mask he had just put on was completely shattered. He stared at my face with a look of pure, unfiltered shock. It was as if no one in his entire life had ever dared to raise their voice at him, let alone scold him like a reckless child. Our faces were mere inches apart. I could feel the ragged warmth of his breath against my cheek. His dark, feral eyes searched mine, the dangerous intensity slowly softening into something entirely different. Something deeply curious. He didn't pull away from my hold. Instead, he leaned slightly more of his weight against me, the ghost of a devastating smirk playing at the corner of his lips. I managed to guide him back onto the beige sofa, his heavy frame sinking into the cushions with a slow, defeated sigh. The sudden shift from arrogant defiance to reluctant surrender completely changed the atmosphere in my tiny living room. He didn't try to stand again. He just lay back, his dark eyes tracking my every movement as I pulled a thick woven blanket from the hall closet and draped it carefully over his shivering, bare shoulders. The rain continued to lash against the apartment window, a rhythmic drumming that only amplified the heavy silence stretching between us. I pulled up a wooden dining chair and sat a few feet away. As an ER nurse, my shift wasn't officially over until my patient was stable, and his pulse was still entirely too erratic. The silence felt too loud, too intimate. To keep my own nervous energy at bay, I started to talk. "You don't have to tell me who did this to you," I said softly, keeping my voice low so it wouldn't jar him. "But usually, the men who come into my trauma ward looking like you do, they don't have happy stories." He didn't answer immediately. He just watched me from the shadows of the couch, his sharp features partially hidden by the dim light. "I was in the wrong place," he finally murmured, his deep voice carrying a faint, guarded edge. I knew it was a lie, but I didn't push. Instead, I found myself filling the quiet space with my own voice. I told him about my grueling 12-hour shifts at the hospital. I talked about how my mother used to say I had a terrible habit of bringing home stray animals, and how I guessed that habit had evolved into dragging bleeding strangers out of alleyways. I rambled, a defense mechanism I couldn't seem to break when the adrenaline finally started to fade. But as I spoke, I noticed something change in him. The feral, lethal tension that had coiled around his muscles slowly began to unwind. He wasn't just hearing me, he was listening. His intense, dark gaze traced the lines of my face, soaking in my words, like a man who hadn't experienced genuine, unfiltered warmth in years. In his world, I would later learn, people only spoke to manipulate, to beg, or to threaten. But here, in the safety of my cramped living room, I was just a woman, trying to keep him awake. "Why do you care?" he asked suddenly, interrupting my story about a chaotic night in the triage unit. His voice was barely above a whisper, thick with a strange, quiet curiosity. I looked at him, feeling an unexpected flutter in my chest. "Because you were hurting, and I fixed things." He didn't say anything else. He just held my gaze in the dark, the invisible wall between us cracking just a fraction as the storm raged outside. The harsh morning sunlight streaming through my blinds woke me. I shifted, my neck incredibly stiff from falling asleep in the wooden dining chair. The storm had passed, leaving behind the distant, muffled sounds of early city traffic. I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, my mind instantly snapping back to the bleeding, breathtakingly handsome stranger who had taken over my living room. I quickly turned toward the beige sofa, ready to check his fever and inspect his stitches. The sofa was completely empty. I stood up so fast my chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. Hey, I called out, my voice raspy with sleep. Only silence answered me. I walked cautiously toward the tiny kitchen and the bathroom, but my apartment was entirely vacant. He was gone. I walked back to the living room, my gaze falling on the sofa. The thick woven blanket I had draped over his bare shoulders was folded with absolute precision and resting on the armrest. The leftover bloodied gauze and trauma shears were neatly stacked on the coffee table. Even the worst of the dark stains on my rug had been scrubbed at, leaving a damp patch behind. My work tote was sitting open on the armchair, the heavy black handgun completely gone. He had vanished like a ghost in the night. A sharp, confusing sting of disappointment settled heavy in my chest. I stared at the neatly folded blanket, completely baffled by my own reaction. I was an ER nurse. I saved lives every day, and patients left when they were discharged. It was the natural order of things. I should have been overwhelmed with relief that a clearly dangerous man was no longer sitting in my home. Instead, I was just frustrated. Stubborn, ungrateful idiot, I muttered to the empty room, picking up the discarded medical supplies. He had lost far too much blood to be walking the streets alone. His stitches were fresh. If he pushed his massive frame too hard, he would tear the wound wide open again. The thought of him collapsing in another alley, cold and alone, made a knot of genuine worry tighten in my throat. I spent the next hour cleaning up the physical remnants of his presence, tossing the ruined rug into the trash and throwing the blanket into the wash. But no matter how much I scrubbed the coffee table, I couldn't seem to wash away the lingering, masculine scent of rain and expensive cologne that still hung in the air. I forced myself to get ready for my next shift at the hospital, tying my curls back into their usual tight bun. I told myself his leaving was for the best. He was a dangerous secret that belonged to a violent world I wanted absolutely nothing to do with. I would never see him again, and my quiet life could finally go back to normal. I just had no idea how spectacularly wrong I was. 3 days had passed since the phantom in my living room disappeared. I threw myself into the relentless, chaotic rhythm of the emergency room, using the endless stream of patients to drown out the lingering memory of his dark, intense eyes. I almost convinced myself that the entire night had been a bizarre, adrenaline-fueled dream. Until Thursday afternoon. The triage desk was usually a battlefield of ringing phones, beeping monitors, and shouting paramedics. But at exactly 2 o'clock, a heavy, unnatural silence swept through the automatic double doors. The frantic energy of the ER didn't just slow down, it completely stopped. I looked up from updating a patient's chart, ready to scold whoever was causing the bottleneck. The words died in my throat. Walking through the pristine white halls of my hospital, parting the crowd of doctors and nurses without saying a single word, was him. He was no longer the bleeding, vulnerable stranger I had dragged out of an alley. He was a king, stepping into his domain. He wore a flawlessly tailored, dark charcoal suit that accentuated his massive, broad shoulders and towering height. The wild, dark hair I had brushed away from his forehead was expertly styled, framing the sharp, aristocratic features that had been haunting my sleep. Flanking him were 4 imposing men in dark suits, their posture radiating a quiet, lethal warning that told everyone in the room to keep their distance. But it wasn't the terrifying security detail that made my heart race. It was what he held in his large, scarred hand. A massive, elegant bouquet of pristine, white peonies. The whispering started almost immediately. My fellow nurses leaned over the countertops, their eyes wide with disbelief and undeniable jealousy. A few of the resident doctors, men who usually strutted around the ward with inflated egos, suddenly shrank against the walls, instinctively recognizing an apex predator when they saw one. His dark, piercing gaze swept over the crowded room with absolute indifference until his eyes finally locked onto mine. The rest of the hospital faded away. The distance between us evaporated as he bypassed the security desk entirely, his long strides eating up the floor until he stood directly in front of my station. The scent of expensive cologne washed over me, identical to the lingering aroma he had left behind on my sofa. The air backed up in my lungs as I looked up at the towering man in front of me. "You," I breathed, my voice betraying my shock. "Me," he replied, the deep, gravelly weight of his voice making the fine hairs on my arms stand up. He didn't smile, but a dangerously captivating softness flickered in his dark eyes as he held the flowers out to me. "I believe I owe you for a ruined rug, Mila." I stood there, my fingers tightening around the damp stems of the white peonies. The entire emergency ward was holding its collective breath, watching the untouchable man in the charcoal suit stand before my triage desk. Before I could formulate a single word, a sharp, annoyed voice broke the silence. "Excuse me," Dr. Hayes barked, marching up to the desk. He was a senior resident who had spent the last 3 months finding excuses to brush past my shoulder or corner me in the break room. "This is an active medical ward, not a restaurant or a flower shop. If you aren't bleeding, you need to clear the floor." Jung-ho didn't flinch. He didn't even turn his head to look at the doctor. Instead, he simply shifted his weight. The movement was slight, but it was enough. The 2 massive men in dark suits flanking him stepped forward, their presence radiating a quiet, terrifying violence. Dr. Hayes stopped dead in his tracks, all the color draining from his face, as he suddenly realized he was speaking to a man who could ruin his life with a single nod. "Speaking of restaurants," Jung-ho murmured, his deep, resonant voice completely ignoring the trembling doctor. He leaned slightly over the high counter, invading my personal space until the intoxicating scent of bergamot wrapped around me. "I would like to take you to dinner tomorrow night, to properly thank you for saving my life." My pulse hammered frantically against my ribs. I looked at the tailored perfection of his suit, the quiet lethality of his guards, and the terrified faces of my coworkers. He wasn't just a patient anymore. He was absolute chaos, wrapped in wealth and danger, stepping directly into my quiet, structured world. Panic, hot and sudden, flared in my chest. I couldn't do this. I couldn't let his dangerous reality collide with mine. "I can't," I blurted out, taking a quick step back. I set the heavy bouquet onto the desk, putting physical distance between us. I'm busy tomorrow night. I have a double shift. Actually, I'm busy all week. You don't owe me anything. Please, just leave." A heavy, dangerous silence stretched between us. I braced myself, expecting the terrifying temper I had witnessed in my apartment. I expected him to demand my compliance. Instead, Jung-ho's dark gaze slowly dragged from the discarded flowers back to my face. The corner of his mouth ticked upward into a slow, devastating smirk. It wasn't the smile of a man who had been rejected. It was the smile of a predator who had just found a hunt entirely worth his time. "Busy all week," he repeated softly, the gravelly edge of his tone feeling more like a promise than a question. He straightened his posture, buttoning his suit jacket with a fluid, arrogant grace. "We will see about that, Mila." He didn't wait for a response. He simply turned and walked out, taking all the oxygen in the room with him, and leaving me completely terrified of what he would do next. I thought rejecting him in front of my entire ward would be the end of it. I drastically underestimated the sheer determination of Yun Jung-ho. He didn't send another disruptive bouquet of flowers. He sent an absolute feast. The very next evening, the tiny, sterile hospital break room was completely transformed. Silver-heated trays lined the cheap plastic tables, filling the air with the rich, mouth-watering scent of roasted bulgogi, steaming dumplings, and fresh vegetables. A discreet, heavy cardstock note rested next to a perfectly brewed cup of my favorite chamomile tea. "Eat well, Mila." No signature. Just the quiet, undeniable proof that he was paying attention. My fellow nurses practically wept with joy over the catered luxury, but every sip of tea I took felt like a dangerous surrender. He was weaving himself into the fabric of my daily routine, dismantling my defenses without ever stepping foot inside the building. But the real test came at 3 a.m. I pushed through the heavy glass exit doors, pulling my scrub jacket tight against the biting night chill. The employee parking lot was usually desolate and unnerving at this hour, a dark stretch of concrete I always hurried across. Tonight, it wasn't empty. Parked under the amber glow of a street lamp, directly across from my beat-up sedan, was a sleek, dark luxury car. Leaning casually against the driver's side door was Jung-ho. He wore a simple black turtleneck and dark trousers, stripping away the untouchable corporate armor he had worn the day before. His hands were tucked into his pockets, his breath pluming in the freezing air. The moment the exit doors clicked shut behind me, his dark, intensely focused gaze locked onto mine. My pulse gave a treacherous flutter. I stopped on the pavement, clutching my bag to my chest. "I told you I was busy," I called out, my voice lacking the stern conviction I had practiced in my head. He pushed off the car, closing the distance between us with slow, measured steps. He stopped a respectful few feet away, close enough for me to feel the warmth radiating from his tall frame, but far enough to give me an illusion of safety. "You said you were too busy for a date," he replied, his voice a low, smooth vibration in the quiet night. "I am not asking for a date tonight. I am simply making sure you get to your car safely." I stared at him, completely disarmed by his calm sincerity. There was no arrogance in his expression, only a quiet, unwavering devotion that scared me more than his wealth or his security detail ever could. He wasn't demanding my time, he was earning it. He reached past me, pulling my car door open with effortless grace. "Get some sleep, Mila," he murmured, his gaze dropping briefly to my lips before meeting my eyes again. "I will be here tomorrow." It took exactly 1 week of his quiet, relentless devotion to break me down. When I finally whispered, "yes," to dinner, I thought I was agreeing to a public meal. I didn't realize I was completely surrendering the last of my control. I stepped out of my apartment building, shivering in a deep emerald slip dress, the cool night wind instantly biting my bare shoulders. Jung-ho was waiting beside a sleek, elongated black town car. When his dark gaze swept over me, the space between us seemed to evaporate. The dangerous, composed syndicate air disappeared, replaced by a man looking at me with absolute, starving reverence. He didn't speak. He simply took off his heavy suit jacket and draped it over my shoulders. The lingering warmth of his skin and the rich scent of smoked cedar wrapping around me as a physical shield against the cold. The moment we slid into the cavernous back seat, the tinted glass partition separating us from the driver glided up, sealing us in a private, soundproof world. The city lights of Seoul blurred past the windows, but I couldn't look anywhere except at the man sitting impossibly close to me. "You look beautiful, Mila," he murmured, his deep voice vibrating in the quiet space. Where are we going? I asked, my voice trembling slightly as I looked at his hands. The same scarred hands I had stitched up just weeks ago. He reached out, his long fingers gently capturing my chin to guide my gaze back to his. Home. Before I could even process the word, his mouth crashed down onto mine. It was no hesitation, no gentle testing of the waters. It was a bruising, desperate claim that stole every ounce of oxygen from my lungs. I gasped against his lips, and his hands immediately dropped to my waist, hauling me across the soft leather seat until I was pressed flush against his solid, muscular chest. My hands tangled in his thick, dark hair as the kiss deepened. The sheer heat radiating from his body was intoxicating, melting away every rational defense I had left. He kissed me like a man who had been dying of thirst, his thumb tracing the curve of my jaw, while his other hand gripped my hip with a possessive, territorial strength. By the time the town car finally slowed to a halt, my lipstick was ruined, and my chest was heaving against his. I looked out the tinted window, expecting a restaurant. Instead, towering wrought iron gates swung open to reveal a massive, secluded private estate hidden deep in the hills, surrounded by shadows and the subtle presence of armed guards. Jung-ho pulled back just enough to press his forehead against mine, his breathing ragged. "You saved my life in the dark," he whispered fiercely, his thumb brushing over my swollen lower lip. "Now, I am going to show you exactly how I plan to spend it." The morning sunlight was bright and unfamiliar, filtering through tall windows to warm the dark silk sheets tangled around my legs. I woke up slowly, instantly hyper-aware of the heavy, protective arm banded securely across my waist. I turned my head against the soft pillows. Jung-ho was already awake. The dangerous, untouchable heir to Seoul's underworld was nowhere to be found, replaced by a man looking at me with absolute, quiet devotion. His dark hair was beautifully messy, falling over his forehead, and the harsh, arrogant lines of his face were entirely relaxed. When I finally met his gaze, his hand shifted. His long, calloused fingers gently brushed a stray curl away from my cheek, his touch so incredibly tender, it made my breath hitch. "Good morning," he murmured. His morning voice was a deep, rough rumble that sent a delicious shiver straight down my spine. A shy smile pulled at my lips as I rested my palm flat against his bare, scarred chest, feeling the steady, calming rhythm of his heart. The memory of the night before, the fierce, desperate way he had pulled me into his arms and proven exactly how much he wanted me, made my skin flush all over again. Wrapped in his heat, hidden away in his secluded estate, the chaos of his dangerous reality felt completely out of reach. For the first time in a very long time, I felt undeniably safe. But that beautiful illusion didn't last. The absolute quiet of the sprawling house was abruptly pierced by the sharp, aggressive clatter of heels striking marble. The sound echoed sharply up the grand staircase, immediately followed by a woman's voice. She was speaking rapid, furious Korean, her tone dripping with ice and undeniable authority. Several male voices murmured in response, sounding distinctly panicked and apologetic, scrambling to keep up with her. The shift in Jung-ho was terrifyingly fast. The soft, devoted lover vanished in a fraction of a second. His jaw locked tightly, a dangerous muscle ticking beneath his skin as he sat up abruptly, the dark sheets pooling around his waist. The lethal, coiled tension had completely returned to his broad shoulders. "Who is that?" I whispered, pulling the silk covers up to my chest, a sudden cold spike of anxiety rushing through me. Jung-ho didn't look at me right away. He stared at the heavy bedroom doors, his eyes darkening into a cold, furious storm. "My mother," he answered, his voice completely stripped of its previous warmth, leaving behind only a deadly warning. He stood up from the mattress, grabbing a discarded shirt from the floor. "Stay exactly where you are, Mila. Do not leave this room." The heavy bedroom doors clicked shut, leaving me alone in the sudden, suffocating silence of the master suite. A heavy knot of adrenaline tightened in my chest. I couldn't just sit in the bed like a hidden secret while a war erupted downstairs. I slipped out from under the covers, the morning air suddenly freezing against my bare skin. My emerald dress from last night was discarded somewhere in the dark, so I grabbed one of Jung-ho's crisp white dress shirts from a nearby chair. The fabric swallowed my frame entirely, the hem hitting mid-thigh, carrying the faint, intoxicating scent of smoked cedar, and him. I crept out into the expansive hallway, the cool stone floor biting into my bare feet. The furious exchange of rapid, icy Korean echoed up the sweeping grand staircase. I stayed close to the wall, peering over the banister down into the sunlit foyer. Jung-ho stood like a lethal statue in the center of the room, his back rigid with restrained violence. Facing him were two women who looked like they had stepped out of a high-fashion magazine, and a nightmare. The younger woman, his sister, wore a sharp designer suit, her arms crossed in quiet, calculated amusement. But it was the older woman who commanded the room, Madame Yoon. She wore a flawless, tailored coat, her posture radiating absolute, terrifying authority. She wasn't yelling. She didn't need to. Every quiet syllable she spoke seemed to lower the temperature in the entire house. Then, the sister's gaze drifted upward. She tapped her mother's arm, pointing toward the top of the stairs. The conversation abruptly died. Madame Yoon slowly lifted her chin, her piercing dark eyes locking directly onto me. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had ever experienced. Her gaze swept over my messy curls, my bare legs, and the oversized men's shirt identifying exactly whose bed I had just crawled out of. The disgust on her face wasn't subtle. It was absolute, venomous disdain. "So," Madame Yoon spoke, switching to flawless, razor-sharp English, her voice dripping with aristocratic contempt. "This is why you have been ignoring the syndicate's alliances. A common hospital worker playing dress-up in my son's clothes." My breath caught in my throat. I instinctively gripped the wooden banister, feeling incredibly small and entirely out of my depth. Before the matriarch could utter another insult, Jung-ho moved. He didn't just step forward. He placed his massive, imposing frame directly between my line of sight and his mother, entirely shielding me from her venom. "You will not speak to her," Jung-ho commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl that shook the very foundations of the room. He stared down his mother, the dangerous king of the underworld, fully returning to defend his own. "And you will never look at her like that again." The heavy silence that followed Jung-ho's warning was thick enough to choke on. I stood frozen on the staircase, my bare toes curling against the cold stone as I clutched the collar of his oversized dress shirt. Madame Yoon didn't flinch. Instead, a dry, humorless laugh slipped past her lips. She looked at her son, not with fear, but with a calculated, weary disappointment. "You are letting a brief distraction cloud your judgment," she said smoothly, adjusting the strap of her designer handbag. "The daughter of the Choi family arrives from London next month. The marriage contracts are already being drafted. Do not embarrass our bloodline by parading a common hospital worker around as if she belongs in our world." A sharp, sudden ache settled deep in my chest, Marriage contracts. The words echoed in my mind, a harsh reminder of the massive, unbridgeable gap between my quiet life and his ruthless reality. I was a nurse who worked double shifts just to pay my rent. He was a man whose entire future was negotiated in underground boardrooms. Chung-ho didn't step back. He actually took a step closer to his mother, his towering frame casting a long, dark shadow over the sunlit foyer. "Cancel the contracts," Chung-ho replied. His voice was a flat, dead calm that was infinitely more terrifying than a shout. "I will not marry the Choi heiress. I am not a pawn for your expansion plans." "You are the head of this family," his sister Sujin finally snapped, her amused expression shattering into genuine panic. "You have obligations, Chung-ho. You can't just—" "My only obligation is to this syndicate, and I rule it on my own terms," he interrupted, his dark eyes flashing with a feral, absolute authority that silenced his sister instantly. He pointed a long, scarred finger toward the massive front doors. "This is my private estate. You are trespassing. Both of you, get out." Madame Yoon's flawless mask finally cracked, her jaw tightening with raw fury. She stared at him for a long, volatile moment, before lifting her chin and shifting her piercing gaze back to me. It wasn't just a look. It was a silent, lethal promise. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and marched out, her daughter scrambling closely behind. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing the quiet back into the house. Chung-ho stood completely still at the bottom of the stairs, his broad chest rising and falling heavily. Then he turned around. The icy, ruthless king vanished the moment his eyes found mine. He took the steps two at a time, closing the distance between us until his large, warm hands gently cupped my face. "Look at me, Mila," he murmured, his thumbs brushing away a stray tear I hadn't even realized had fallen. "They are gone. I choose you. I will never let them touch you." 3 days of deceptive quiet followed the explosive confrontation at the estate. Chung-ho had doubled the security detail assigned to me, their discreet presence a constant reminder of the invisible target now painted on my back. But even his elite guards couldn't outmaneuver the matriarch of his syndicate. I had just stepped out of a quiet cafe near the hospital, the cold afternoon wind biting at my winter coat, when a sleek silver sedan glided to a halt at the curb. Before I could process what was happening, my assigned guards were seamlessly intercepted and blocked by 4 men in immaculate gray suits. Before I could even reach for my phone, a sharply dressed female assistant stepped out of the sedan, gesturing smoothly to the open back door. "Madame Yoon requests your presence for tea," she said. Her tone made it absolutely clear it was not an invitation. 15 minutes later, I was led into an ultra-exclusive private tea room. The air smelled of expensive jasmine and quiet intimidation. The room was divided by delicate painted silk screens, but the atmosphere was anything but fragile. Sitting at a low, dark walnut table was Jung-ho's mother. She didn't look up from her steaming porcelain cup as I was guided to sit opposite her. For a long, suffocating moment, the only sound was the faint pouring of tea. Then, without breaking her terrifyingly calm posture, Madame Yoon reached into her designer handbag. She produced a thick, heavy envelope and slid it smoothly across the polished wood. It stopped mere inches from my hands. $3 million, she stated, her voice a flawless, aristocratic blade. Untraceable. Enough to pay off your nursing school debt, buy a comfortable home in a very safe neighborhood, and ensure you never have to work another grueling 12-hour shift again. My pulse raced erratically against my ribs. I stared at the envelope, the sheer, crushing weight of her wealth pressing down on me. "The Choi family is expecting a formal engagement by the end of the month," she continued. her piercing dark eyes finally lifting to meet mine. My son is currently blinded by a temporary infatuation. You saved his life, and for that, we are compensating you generously. But you do not belong in our world, Mila. If you stay, you will only bring chaos to his syndicate and absolute ruin to your own quiet life. Take the money and vanish. The fear inside me was very real, cold and sharp. But as I looked at the bribe meant to erase me, I thought of the fierce, desperate way Chung-ho had pulled me into his arms, shielding me from this exact woman. He had risked everything to protect me. I refused to run. I didn't touch the envelope. Instead, I lifted my chin, forcing my trembling hands into my lap. "Keep your money," I said softly, holding the matriarch's venomous gaze. "I am not for sale." The retaliation didn't begin with a dramatic ambush. It started as an invisible poison seeping into my sanctuary. Just 2 days after I refused Madame Yoon's money, the structural pillars of my life began to crack. First, my scheduled shifts were mysteriously erased from the hospital database. Then, my secure locker in the staff room was forced open. Nothing of monetary value was taken, but resting perfectly in the center of my folded scrubs was a single, violently crushed white peony. The exact flower Chung-ho had brought me weeks ago. It was a silent, chilling promise that his mother's reach was infinite, and there was nowhere I could hide. The constant paranoia was suffocating. Every unexpected noise in the ER made my heart race. Every shadow in the parking lot looked like a threat. By the time I walked out into the freezing night after a grueling shift, my nerves were completely frayed. Chung-ho was waiting by my car, his tall frame a comforting yet terrifying shadow against the dim streetlights. The moment he saw my face, his relaxed posture snapped into lethal alertness. He reached for me, the rich scent of smoked cedar wrapping around my senses. But I took a desperate step back. The rejection physically hurt, but survival demanded it. "Mila," he murmured, his deep voice thick with sudden concern. "What happened?" "I can't do this," my voice cracked, the exhaustion and terror finally spilling over. I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering in the cold. "Your mother isn't just threatening me, Jung-ho. She is in my hospital. She is destroying my career, my sanity. I look over my shoulder every single second of the day." He froze. The realization of what his mother had done settled over his features, replacing his concern with a terrifying, cold fury. The sharp line of his jaw tightened, his hands curling into heavy fists at his sides. "I just want my quiet life back," I whispered, hot tears finally blurring my vision. "I am terrified. Please, just let me go." He closed the distance between us, completely ignoring my attempt to pull away. He didn't grab my wrists or use his overwhelming strength to trap me. Instead, his large, warm hands gently framed my face, his thumbs carefully catching my tears before they could fall. "I am so sorry she touched your world," he breathed, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the rest of the city fade away. The lethal syndicate air was gone, leaving only a man fiercely devoted to keeping me safe. "But I will not let you go. I would rather tear my own family apart than watch you walk away." He didn't take me home to hide me. He took me directly into the fire. Less than an hour after wiping my tears in the freezing parking lot, Jung-ho's town car glided to a halt outside a towering glass skyscraper in the city's financial district. I was trembling, still wearing my medical scrubs beneath my heavy coat, completely out of place as his elite guards flanked us through a private underground entrance. "Jung-ho, where are we?" I whispered, my voice tight with panic. He didn't answer. He simply laced his long, scarred fingers through mine, his grip an unbreakable anchor. The elevator doors opened to the penthouse level, revealing a sprawling, ultra-modern boardroom. The air inside was thick with the scent of aged scotch and quiet, calculating wealth. Sitting at the head of a massive dark walnut table was Madame Yoon. Beside her sat several powerful-looking older men, including the head of the Choi family, finalizing the very marriage contracts meant to erase my existence. The moment we stepped over the threshold, the low murmur of negotiations died instantly. Madame Yoon stood up, her flawless composure slipping as she stared at our joined hands. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice echoing in the sudden, suffocating silence. "You dare bring her here? To a closed syndicate council?" Jung-ho didn't stop until we reached the center of the room. He didn't drop my hand. Instead, he pulled me slightly behind his broad, muscular frame, positioning himself as a physical shield against the entire room. "The council is closed because the alliances are dead," Jung-ho stated, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that commanded absolute submission. He reached into his coat pocket with his free hand, pulled out a stack of heavily stamped documents, the Choi marriage drafts, and dropped them onto the polished wood. A collective gasp from the syndicate elders filled the air. "My syndicate does not bow to intimidation, and I do not take orders on who I will marry," Jung-ho continued, his dark eyes locking onto his mother with a feral, lethal intensity. "You targeted the woman who saved my life. You brought your threats into her hospital. That ends tonight." He turned slightly, pulling me flush against his side. The sheer heat radiating from his body steadied my trembling legs. He looked down at me, the ruthless king vanishing for a fraction of a second to offer me a look of pure, unapologetic devotion before turning his terrifying gaze back to the elders. "Look closely," Jung-ho commanded the room, his voice ringing with the absolute authority of the underworld's true ruler. "This is Mila. She is my choice. She is my future wife. If a single threat reaches her again, I will not just burn these contracts. I will burn every family in this room to ash." The war for my survival was over, but the war for my crown had just begun.